Hello, this is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Now, we have kind of a fun one for you today. Andrew Keen, who has a podcast called Keen On, which he would like to recommend that you subscribe to it, did an interview of Emily on our new book, Addictive Ideologies. It was a little bit testy at times, and it made it fun. I know put Emily on the hot seat, but it was a good interview and one that we encourage you to listen to. However, we're going to talk a little bit about it today. Emily.
Now, Paul, in his defense, I was brought on. He didn't really know a lot about what was going on. It was right after the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that just blew out. The pitch was that I had the solution to the conflict.
The 10,000-year-old problem in Israel we were going to fix with our book.
I think it was a bit of a lofty sell.
Well, if that's what he was sold on, I would agree. That's a tough pitch.
It was a high bar.
All right, so here's my question. It did seem like it was kind of a tough interview, one that he was trying to ask pointed questions. Now, I'm not sure if he was biased. Or if he was just trying to make it interesting. And it was interesting, I will give it that. It made it more interesting, at least from my watching it.
Well, I appreciated that he took the position of the skeptic and the critic, because if I'm only talking to people who agree with me or believe in me or are very gentle with me, it's not really going to push the boundary to really discern and find the truth.
By the way, this is an important thing in society. We're the optimistic American. I say this often. Being optimistic doesn't mean you ignore the problems. But there is a pessimistic group, too, who sees everything from a pessimistic side. Now, I tend to believe that group, that they believe that the world is, at the end of the day, utter chaos. There's no real hope for where we're going, and that and consequently, they have a negative outlook. But they're important because they ask questions that we have to answer. It ends up falling on the optimistic group to not only answer the questions, but to find the solutions. Because there's no way you're going to find a solution if you're the pessimist. You start out with believing that it can't be fixed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but it forces us to really find that solution and be able to find something that is really defensible with the information that we have. And so it was a great learning opportunity. And I don't want to make the assumption that this is his bias or his perception. He's also hosting a show, and so
it was kind of a heavy one.
Controversy sells.
Yeah.
As we
All right.
know.
So one of the things I think that you've made mention to me is that maybe you could have done better by laying out our thesis in the beginning instead of answering the question. So before we start it, why don't you lay out what the thesis to our book actually was?
So I've come at the complex question of looking at genocides and acts of terrorism and questioning how does this happen from the psychological perspective. Well, you, Paul, you've looked at it from the political and the sociological perspective. And so with me doing the evaluations, the forensic work that I've done on terrorists, people being accused of first-degree murder, and also with extreme ideologies, incel ideologies, and also radicalized ideologies. These are important perspectives that help us understand mass atrocities. We used my family's historical example of fleeing and surviving persecution as Jews in Baghdad under the regime of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam Hussein as a case illustration. But really, this is a modern problem, and we've seen classic examples of what occurred in the Bosnian genocide, Cambodian genocide, and also the Rwandan genocide. And so the question really is, how is it that normal people, average people, become bad?
And Emily, I think the thesis from that question, you're right, the big question that we were asking was, how does this happen? How do normal people get engaged in doing such horrendous acts? Our thesis was, number one, that in almost all acts of genocides, and for that matter, in almost every terrorist act that you see, there is always a connection to ideology. Number two, that those ideologies that it's connected to tend to come from a group think. They tend to look at things, they look at the world in terms of the oppressed and the oppressor. And the third issue that was maybe the most important was, what was the name of the psychologist, Joyce?
Joyce Bellinger.
Yeah, Joyce Ballinger said that that as individuals begin to get involved with an ideology, what happens is that other people start to cut them out. And they stop wanting to be around other people because it confronts the idea that they have. And so they only start talking to other people who have a similar view. And that tends to take them more towards radicalization and more towards violence. So the question becomes, it is an addiction. It meets the very definition of an addiction. An addiction is you keep doing something over and over again, even though you know that it's causing you harm and other people harm. So the question becomes, how do we stop this from happening? How do we get engaged on the front end? And there I think we have to start with the negative bias. If you can, explain the negative bias and how the negative bias has an effect on people on people becoming either radicalized or becoming more involved in ideologies, or for that matter, becoming hopeless.
Well, yes, Paul, that's the amygdala hijack. That's where the limbic system and the emotional response system takes over in a fight, flight, freeze response in terms of survival, and overrides the frontal lobe and that higher order executive functioning cognitive thinking, where people are really thinking through decisions and difficult situations with evidence, with rational thought, with logical thought, weighing the facts. And so when that emotional response system is overriding them, they're not really able to discern information accurately. So if a dictator is giving them the solution, well, just blame that out group, and it is a simpler solution, and you see yourself as a victim or as oppressed, then there's that reason and investment to just that motivation to follow along.
Mm-hmm. So as the amygdala hijacks that neocortex, takes over the rational thinking, we get this distorted picture, which is what I think most people have. What I find fascinating about that is when you start looking at our solutions, I mean, certainly there have to be political solutions. I think what we have in this country today, where the two parties control the primaries and the two parties are increasingly becoming controlled by more extreme groups, is highly problematic for the United States, and it doesn't even represent close to the majority. I think educational reforms are important. But the reform that we talk about is the reforms that relate to individuals. And that starts with the concept of knowing the truth, right? There are 7 different ideals that are involved in that. Knowing the truth, making certain that you're accountable for the things that you've done, also making certain that you try to build strength, that you find a sense of meaning, and all of those issues I saw that you spoke about. One of the things I also found interesting about Andrew's interview was, and again, I don't know if this was his own bias or if he was genuinely just asking the question, but there's this sense of him trying to create a justification for the 13-year-old boy who went into Jerusalem a few weeks ago or a week ago and murdered people, as if the fact that
attempted to murder,
he's dealing with oppression is a reason to do that. Well, if that's the case, gosh, that gives a justification to the woke society to commit murder. That gives a justification to the alt-right to commit murder. If they believe that they're being oppressed, then they should have the right to be able to commit murder. And by the way, Western liberal democracy is not an ideology. It's just not, right? Not according to almost any social scientist. It's not. But what we're talking about, even if you wanted to define it as one, we're talking about those ideologies that want to talk about the world in terms of the oppressed and the oppressor, meaning they're picking out someone that's causing them a challenge in their life. Now, you're Jewish, and I find this to be fascinating. We have in this country the alt-right, who tends to think that Jews are an inferior class, and we have a woke left who thinks that you're part of a white privilege. And consequently, they believe that you come from this that your background is this country that is some colonial state, which, by the way, just isn't true. I mean, if you look at all the facts about it, I thought you did a good job of not taking the bait on this, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
But the idea that Israel is a colonial power, it just couldn't be farther from the truth. When Israel came into Jerusalem to begin with, there was nothing there. You can go look at Mark Twain and others who commented on it, and that's very clear. But even if you wanted to go back, the Jews controlled the world for a while, and then somewhere around the 7th century, Islam took it over. And then from Islam, the Ottomans took it over. And then when the Ottomans lost it, by the way, the Romans were in there someplace, but when the Ottomans lost it to the British controlled it. The point that I'm giving is Israel built up something that was very special, and they are a democracy, and they do have to live within the confines of how the world sees them. It matters. That's not true in authoritarian states like China and Russia. And to do any type of comparison between Adolf Hitler and Israel, it's preposterous. But in saying that, I thought you did a good job by not taking the bait, because the real discussion here is, how do you fix it? And he liked to compare Martin Luther King to Malcolm X. My answer to that's really simple. Ideology or not, Malcolm X is wrong. You're not going to fix the problem with that. You could destroy a bunch of people's lives, the people that you go in and kill, and the people who did the killings. You see that every day in prisons. I'd love to hear your input on that.
Yeah, I think there were, two major issues based on what he said that I think I could have added some more elaboration on. And one was when he said, when is killing justified? And that's when he was talking about that 13-year-old boy who attempted to kill and did shoot a father and son in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, he was shot and not killed and survived. So all survived. But it's a tragic story, no matter which angle or side you want to look at it from. And I think about, well, killing would be justified if it was in direct defense of you and your family and it was imminent threat and danger. Not when you're deciding, I feel hopeless and I feel helpless and I'm oppressed and I'm angry at this group and I have no one else to blame. And I don't feel like I have any other control. And so I'm going to martyr myself.
People who had nothing to do with this.
Yeah, random. And shooting people in their back, and they have no idea who I am or for what reason, and there's absolutely no relationship or reason.
By the way, you've done evals on people who've done exactly that.
Absolutely.
And here's my question. Did it make anybody's life any better?
No. And even looking at it from the perspective of somebody, and this was a question, like, well, what were the Holocaust people? What about the Jews in Warsaw? He said, did they not have justification to go and kill? And I said, well, let's look at Viktor Frankl. He would have every right to kill a Nazi. They took his family, they destroyed everything that he knew and loved, and he would have every right to kill a Nazi who had imprisoned him. And yet he didn't. His main focus was to survive and to publish his book, and he found meaning and power. And look at the beautiful legacy he left. Does he want to be remembered as a Nazi hunter or killer? And is that what he wanted to promote? And maybe he would never be remembered for that. But he gave a really beautiful gift to the world and to humanity.
Self-agency, finding a sense of meaning, finding a purpose in life, and being able to take from a horrific place how you could make something better.
That's a hero to me. That is a hero. And so I think about some of the other people that I've worked with, and just take an example, somebody who had their child horrifically murdered and wanted to seek the death penalty for the perpetrator. And, would that restore a sense of justice for them? No, it's not fulfilling because it doesn't bring their child back. And would they want to stop at the death penalty? Probably not. It wouldn't be enough. And what would be enough? Like, how much more would you have to take out for it to be enough? The answer is it probably would never fill that hole that was left with the death of your child. And so and this is another thing I wish I would have talked about, or I would like to, is the difference between retributive justice and restorative justice. So retributive justice is that eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a soul for a soul. I did mention that in the podcast. And the thing is, you're never going to get peace out of that. It's just going to be devastation and trauma and killing and atrocities built and justifying more devastation, atrocities, killing, and murder. So where is the pathway? Where is the peace? Where is the reconciliation? And we have to look at what happened in South Africa with the post-apartheid state. We'd have to look at what happened in Rwanda with the Hutus and the Tutsis, or different tribunals that have occurred worldwide post-genocide. And how were people able to foster change and hope? And move beyond the trauma. It never replaces the loss. People continue to live with the grief, but it goes towards a restorative sense of justice. It's like, how do you get back something that was lost? Well, you have to recreate something.
All right. So let's watch the show, and then we'll come back at the end just for a few more minutes.
Okay.
Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers.
Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, February the 1st, 2023. New month, but old problems, particularly in the oldest part of the world, or at least the oldest civilizational part of the world, the Middle East. We are back to a cycle of violence in the Middle East, particularly in Israel / Palestine. New York Times reports that Benjamin Netanyahu, the new old Israeli prime minister, is juggling competing goals. Again, old story. For how long? We've been hearing that for a while too. Tony Blinken, Joe Biden's Secretary of State, is visiting Israel right now amidst tension over violence with the Palestinians, according to the Wall Street Journal. Tony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, has urged Israel-Palestine calm. Again, we've heard that one before. Generation after generation of American secretaries of state have urged calm without much impact. According to the London Guardian, left-leaning newspaper, there is a risk now in Israel-Palestine of what they call a third intifada. Others are suggesting that violence between Israel and Palestinians may be entering a devastating new stage, perhaps symbolized by earlier this week, a 13-year-old Palestinian boy wounding 2 people in an attack in East Jerusalem. So it all seems so hopeless. We've been through these cycles time and time again, and I was intrigued to get a pitch from a publicist. I get a lot of pitches on Keen On for new books. Publicist of a new book that seemed intriguing, maybe hopeful. I mean, who knows? There have been so many promises of peace, so many promises of figuring out how to fix this thing. I got a pitch from a new book, co-written by my guest today, Dr. Emily Bashah, a book called Addictive Ideologies, Finding Meaning and Agency When Politics Fails You. The pitch about this book, which came out late last year, in December last year, suggested that it might offer a window of hope, of new thinking about the current situation in Israel-Palestine. So I invited Dr. Emily Bashah, co-author of Addictive Ideologies, onto the show, and she's joining us from Scottsdale in Arizona. Very nice at this time of the year. Dr. Bashah, cheer me up on this stuff. What are you offering? What are you saying in this book that hasn't been said a million times before? How is your book offering some hope for this dismal situation in Israel-Palestine?
Well, thank you so much for having me on your show. My co-author and life partner, Paul Johnson, and I are really excited to talk about hope and talk about optimism and how to promote self-agency and not giving your power away and not allowing politicians to tell you how to think or feel or how to vote, or not allowing political parties or even media, for that matter, to control what you think. And the news and the media really, even in America, you don't even have to go to the Middle East to feel so much in despair and in terror of our fate in this world, and even of humanity in general. You can even look at what's happening in the US, and there can be a lot to feel very pessimistic and skeptic about. But what Paul and I are saying are, let's stop complaining about what everyone else is not doing, and let's look at ourselves. And all you have really to control is yourself. And if each and every one of us took accountability and responsibility for our world and our lives and what is happening within our communities, and affected change positively and limited how much we were impacted or influenced by those who want to control our mind, that one by one, we would be living in a better world and a better society.
I have to admit, Dr. Bashah, I'm not really convinced with what you're saying. It seems terribly vague. Is this the sort of thing you would tell this 13-year-old Palestinian boy who goes around shooting at Israelis, clearly beyond reason, beyond hope, that he should call for agency? Are you suggesting in this Palestine-Israel conflict that the two sides are in the same situation?
Well, I disagree with you. I don't think that a 13-year-old is beyond reason or beyond hope. And I do plenty of forensic evaluations, clinical assessments with people who are accused of terrorism. And I do a deep dive analysis into
sorry to interrupt. You say you do evaluations of people accused of terrorism?
Correct. Yes.
Could you give me some examples?
Yeah, so these are people facing criminal charges, not unlike that 13-year-old in Jerusalem. And the question is, what is the motivation and the driving factor that would cause a 13-year-old to feel that their only choice is to go and shoot people of an opposing party? And, some people would say, well, he's brainwashed and he's been radicalized. And while that very much likely might be true, I would also want to look at historical and intergenerational trauma. What is this person being told? How much power and control do they feel that they have to affect in their lives? What could possibly be some other outlets? There are plenty of factors that go into looking at risk factors for somebody to be indoctrinated and radicalized, and that's isolation, that they don't feel that they have a sense of power and control, and they feel like their options are really limited, and they feel like this is maybe all that they have left or can do.
Are you suggesting, and particularly when it comes to the situation, the dilemma of the Palestinians, Israel, are you suggesting that their behavior, that even ideology itself, is somehow irrational, that it's a form of psychosis?
I would say it's irrational. I'd be cautious in calling it psychosis. I'm very conservative when it comes to using words like delirium or dissociation or psychosis.
Or madness.
Or madness, because those are real psychological constructs, and I don't use those terms loosely. And so I would describe that it is a form of addiction, and there are neurological...
What ideologies are a form of addiction, or suffering is a form of addiction?
Yes. So ideologies are a form of addiction. And what happens in the brain, and there's plenty of neurological studies to show this, is people are running on the reptilian brain. They're operated by their fight or flight or freeze response, which is also termed the amygdala hijack. And they're not operating their neofrontal cortex, which is used for higher order thinking, rational thought. It's a form of really impulse control, behavioral inhibition, and impulse, being able to self-regulate one's emotional responses. So all of these things are so important if the brain is in hyperdrive in this fight, flight, freeze response. There's actually
But you're taking history and the world out of all this. I mean, there are situations, perhaps for the Palestinians living in Israel, not their word for that, or people living under European colonial rule, where anger, resentment, perhaps even violence can be justified. Is that right? Or would you dismiss this? Would you tell, for example, people living in the Congo under Belgium colonial rule that they should have agency, and that their ideology, their hostility to colonialism, is a form of addiction?
So there's a couple things I would say to this, is looking at dissecting of the human condition. Each and every one of us has the propensity for good and evil. We do see that historically, we do see that cross-culturally, and we see that in modern times.
I don't know what that means. We each have the propensity for good and evil. That's an odd thing to say. What do you mean by that?
I'd love to.
I mean, we all have the propensity to, I don't know, murder tens of millions of people.
Correct. Or alternatively, foster hope and optimism and change and growth and leadership and success. So all of those things are possibilities. I don't believe that.
But they're not really. I mean, give me some examples of that. It's very vague. It's not convincing.
I'd love to give you an example. So my family is Jewish Iraqi, and I was born in Canada, but my parents and my family members suffered extreme hardship and trauma and tragedy during the rise of Saddam Hussein. Actually, just last Friday was Holocaust Remembrance Day, and for us was also a remembrance and memorialization of the hangings of Jews who were falsely accused for being spies for Israel, two of whom were 17 years old. This was a political propaganda ploy by Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party in order to incite violence against the Jews. And this is a way of dehumanizing out-group members, to be able to incite violence, because what he was doing was taking an opportunity of fear and change and reform and building anger and resentment, and he needed an out-group in order to do that. There were many other minorities who were also being oppressed and victimized by the Ba'ath Party. But just speaking from personal accounts in my family stories, things that ensued after the hangings was that people's bank accounts were being frozen. People were escaping, leaving everything that they built and left behind them. It became like a witch hunt. Any neighbor or business member could point to whoever they wanted to and say, he's a spy for Israel. And that person was abducted by the government. My grandfather is an example of that. One day he was abducted by political Ba'ath Party security forces, and he went into a jail, which is translated to the Palace of No Return, because any prisoners who went in never came out. He was horrifically tortured. We have declassified CIA reports now showing us and telling us about the mass atrocities that were occurring in these jails. And even to this day, my family has no confirmation of what happened to my grandfather.
So, okay, so no, and this is obviously a tragic story of life under Saddam Hussein, but I'm not entirely sure what this has to do with addictive ideologies.
Well, the question is, how did all those Arabs who were rising in the streets, who were the neighbors and friends of my family members, who went to school with my family members, were suddenly in a day chanting and dancing and rejoicing at the hangings in the public square? or they were rioting in front of the schools, yelling at the Jews who were coming in to attend their classes, or neighbors who were coming in and stealing their items once the houses had been abandoned after people had disappeared. I'm saying these Arabs are not inherently born evil. Something happened and triggered them to then choose and be persuaded and swayed by political parties because they were able to mind control mass populations. And we look at Eric Hoffer, who talks about these mass movements. How does this happen? It comes from people who have lost something and they want it back. And if you have a leader who feels that they can give a promise of giving something that they feel that they have lost, especially if they have a victim mentality, they will stop at no ends and no means.
Are you comparing Saddam Hussein and Benjamin Netanyahu? Sounds as if you are. Are you suggesting that they both bring out the worst in people?
No, absolutely not.
Because I think people would be a little outraged if not everyone loves Benjamin Netanyahu, but
this is not what I'm saying. Yeah, please.
He doesn't even. Please don't. Doesn't even have a mustache.
No. I'm talking about dictators and authoritarians and the rise to power of such people, and they usually are met with very violent ends. Now, I'm not making a comparison there of such leaders, but authoritarian governments and people in masses who open themselves up to be mind controlled, again, going back to the amygdala hijack and addictive ideologies, if they see themselves as victims and who they see themselves as having lost something, and especially if there's...
I take your point, and of course, there's probably a little bit of truth there, but sometimes there are real...
You're totally agreeing with me.
I'm not agreeing with you. I'm suggesting that there may be some truth, but there are real situations of oppression. I mean, what are people supposed to do when they live in a world where their own group, their own community, their own society is, for one reason or other, oppressed? It's not... It seems to be an excuse for almost avoiding the broader theme of injustice, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere in a colonial world. Are you suggesting that there are never reasons to be angry, to pick up sort of political ideologies?
Andrew, I think you're finally starting to understand our point, and it is that there is danger to really holding on to that victim oppressive mindset. And we even see that in counterculture and woke culture, as well as right-wing authoritarianism and the alt-right. They see themselves as an oppressed and oppressed by another group, whatever you want to call that out group. And so they direct their hatred and their animosity and their resentment towards that group so much that, they're willing to give up some of their rights, even if it might mean being able to overcome that group. And so this is where it becomes very concerning. This is not the majority. These are definitely more radicalized right and left wing groups that we see here today. And it is concerning. And so victimization and seeing yourself as oppressed, I'm not saying that you weren't legitimately victimized. I can argue my family was legitimately victimized, that they have a right to hate Arabs. But what would be the purpose? Why, how would that serve a greater good? And does it mean that just because some Arabs had turned on my family members, does that mean that all Arabs must now pay the penalty and the cost for that? No, because we see people as individuals, and I see people as individuals. So I'm not going to lump them all together into one group. I'm not going to be, and this is the danger of anti-Muslim rhetoric, anti-Asian American rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-Jewish rhetoric, whatever it is. I mean, all of that is very, very dangerous. And it does paint that pathway towards this addictive ideology, because especially when you're starting to suppress that neocortex and amplify that fear response, people are willing to give up their agency and their individuality for power.
So let's focus. As I said, the pitch for you was on how your book can help figure out the situation in Israel. How if everyone read your book in Israel Palestine, what would happen? What would be the change? What would you like to see happen?
Well, Paul and I wrote about these 7 ideals, and we break them down and talk about it on our podcast as well, The Optimistic American. We talk about finding truth. We talk about personal accountability, that it's important to find meaning over happiness. What is your purpose in life? Asking, who are you? Again,
that sounds, again, with all due respect, it sounds a little psychobabblish.
It's a very individualistic approach, and it's not about blaming people. It's not about blaming people who have hurt you or maligned you or oppressed you, even though there may be a legitimate right to that. But you inherently have a responsibility. So, Andrew, let's use the example of an angry adolescent living on the Gaza Strip, seeming without a great deal of hope. How should they make sense of that in terms of their own lives? Give me some ways in which the 13-year-old who wants to wound Israelis, how would this change their life? What should they do? Well, I do see them here in America, and
I asked about Palestinians in the West Bank, not about America.
Mm-hmm. You know, the problem is that there's a legitimacy argument, and the concern, and this is where there's this conflict impasse, is that if one feels that they've been legitimized, that automatically delegitimizes the right of the other. And there needs to be a paradigm shift. And so for a 13-year-old, I would look at what has been their family narrative, what has been their community narrative, what have they been told, what are their losses, because there are horrific stories of collective and community and family intergenerational trauma. It exists on both sides. And if you really listen to both Israelis and Palestinians, you would hear that they have these stories of losses and threat and feel of insecurity, and a feeling of a delegitimacy. And if I was working with him, I would want to find, what options and choices do you see that you have to affect change in your personal life, in your family's life? What are those? And how can we help you to be able to affect change in a way that's more pro-social, rather than attacking or killing yourself, or going on a suicide mission in order to make a political statement, or in order to possibly get something back from Hamas that might be rewarding you and possibly your family because of your death. And looking at, how do they really perceive martyrdom? And part of this is ideology. And if they really appreciated
I take your point. Are there legit? I mean, you've got this idea, or the book is called, which I was intrigued with, but also very suspicious, addictive ideologies. Is there such a thing as a non-addictive ideology when it comes to politics?
That would be one that's very balanced. If it's a non,
in your view, but I mean, aren't there such things as legitimate ideologies? Do you have to approve of them as the doctor here for them to be legitimate?
Well, no, I don't have a very...
Could you give me an example of a legitimate ideology? Say, classic Western liberalism. Is that legitimate? John Stuart Mill?
So there are various ideologies. The ones that Paul and I are arguing that become addictive are the ones that are more radicalized and more extreme. And again, it doesn't permit you that logic or rational thought in being able to really discern and evaluate and look at the pros and cons and engage in a meaningful conversation like we are, and being able to debate meaningfully and rationally with evidence and going back and forth. That is healthy. That is.
So you would approve of, I don't know, Martin Luther King, for example, but what about Malcolm X? Would you suggest that his ideology is addictive, whereas MLK's is rational in response to the profound injustice of the subjugation of African Americans in America?
So there's a great researcher, Belanger, who looked at ideologies that promote and incite violence and ones who legitimize violence. And I think this should be a very important differentiating factor. If an ideology is in support of violence or killing or silencing, just like woke culture and council culture is doing, silencing their opposition, who they see as the oppressor, that is removing the right and legitimacy of somebody to be engaging in a rational, intellectual dialogue and be able to debate and be able to have a verbal conflict and to be able to find some kind of resolution. As soon as you're killing that person or silencing them or imprisoning them or violently attacking them, that is an incited form of radicalized ideology, which is very dangerous.
So I assume you would approve of MLK. What about Malcolm X?
Again, I would look at what is, I'm not just going to say, oh, I approve this person or I disapprove of this person. I'm going to actually look at, like, well, what part of what they're saying are you asking my opinion on? I'm not going to support if somebody's propaganda and belief systems are about legitimizing violence towards outgroup members, or even identifying a group on the basis of their race or their religion or their culture, or what they may have that you might not. Or
there could be. Sometimes it seems as if violence is unavoidable and inevitable. Israel was founded on the violence of the Stern Gang. The Palestinian movement was founded on the violence of the PLO that later tried to make some degree of peace with Israel. Is violence for you always irrational?
There has to be consequences for actions. I'd like to believe in a justice system, and I would want to promote a democratic, what we have in America is a wonderful thing. I'm not saying that we have to, overthrow a government on the basis of disagreeing with our current government. I'm saying, well, what about social mobility and mobilizing people and voting? And
we've done many shows, Dr. Bashah, on the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. How were the Jews in Europe supposed to respond to the Nazis? Were they supposed to talk about paradigm shifts and wonder about legitimacy arguments?
Viktor Frankl is a perfect person to go to if you're talking about a Holocaust survivor who has just such insurmountable wisdom and resilience. And I would look to strength, because, safetyism versus strength is something that's very important. And I think something, again, that is relevant and prevalent in what's happening in the Middle East, but also what's happening.
You didn't respond to it. You say Viktor Frankl. What were the Jews of Warsaw supposed to do? Fight back, right?
Well, there are many stories of heroes, child heroes. There were resistance movements of people who lived in the forest during the winters.
Right, but my point is, how do you distinguish between, say, and I'm not necessarily making this argument, but some people might, that there isn't a lot of difference between fighting back against the Nazis or fighting back against the Israelis?
I want to believe in a justice system that works. It may not be perfect, but that's one that I'm going to promote. Because if I believe in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and have a vengeful God that I believe to or I pray to, what kind of promise does that give for humanity? Again, the good and evil exist in all of us, Viktor Frankl could have turned into a killing machine, but he chose to live. He chose to survive in order to publish his book, and he survived such horrific circumstances. There are so many countless stories of resilience and strength, and they gave up their safety. And there are so many people who give up their safety in order for strength, that's not something that they're seeking or they're willing to die for or fight for. But there is a tremendous power in having that meaning and purpose to survive. And so in America, I have many freedoms in here that had I been born in Iraq, I wouldn't have had. I have the opportunity to be a psychologist. I have the opportunity to have a doctorate, to own property, to have a private practice. These are all things I couldn't afford. To be able to be on your show, this is a freedom that I get to exercise and exercise my opinion as a woman. These are all wonderful things that we have to fight to preserve, because it can be taken away. And so I have the opportunity. I would say, I want to fight to defend democracy. I want to fight to defend a justice system that works, that isn't going to hang innocent Jews just for the sake of propaganda.
Okay, Emily, I just listened to those questions. And again, I thought that he was a good questioner. I thought that he did a good job of putting you on the spot, and it was your job to try to defend it. I thought you also did a good job of defending it, by the way. I did notice that if he wasn't biased, he must have had a backache or something, because he kept going, humph, humph. I kept hearing these sounds as you were talking.
There was a little bit of a scoffing and a huffing and a puffing.
And I also noticed at the end, he didn't say goodbye.
I think he hung up on me.
Yeah. So, well, maybe. So with that, let's close this show I'll be Andrew, and I'll say, Emily, thanks for coming on my show. I appreciate it. And I hope you'll make certain that people subscribe to Keen On. Here we go. Thank you. This is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. And I do hope that you subscribe to The Optimistic American. Thanks for joining The Optimistic American show. Help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned, and we can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.